The cold, fluorescent lights flickered above him as Robert Montgomery, the CEO of Montgomery Enterprises, stepped into the restroom. The echo of his polished shoes against the marble floors sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the constant demands of his high-powered position, but the sound of a faint rustling caught his attention. It wasn't the usual hum of the office. No, this was different. This was something that made his heart skip a beat. He stepped closer to the bathroom stalls, expecting nothing more than an empty, sterile restroom. But as the door swung open, a sight unlike any other met his eyes. A woman, unfamiliar to him, was lying slumped against the corner of the bathroom, her back propped awkwardly against the tiled wall. The mop she had been holding lay forgotten. At her side, her hand still gripping it loosely. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. He could hear the faintest rise and fall of her chest, but it wasn't enough to reassure him. Something about the way she was positioned felt wrong. Robert froze. His mind raced to make sense of the situation, but the truth felt too bizarre to grasp. Why was she here? And why was she asleep? No, not asleep, slumped in such an uncomfortable position. He took a cautious step forward, his sharp gaze assessing her every detail. She was dressed in a faded blue uniform, the kind that cleaning staff wore in upscale offices like his. Her hair, long and dark, fell messily over her face, partially covering her features. He couldn't help but notice how delicate her features seemed even in such an unflattering position. His hand hesitated in the air as he approached her, unsure whether to wake her or leave her alone. After all, she was just a cleaning lady, nothing out of the ordinary, no reason to be concerned. But the longer he stood there, the stranger it felt. She shouldn't be here, shouldn't have been left alone in a place like this. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second, until Robert could hear the sound of his own pulse in his ears. He took another cautious step forward and knelt beside her, gingerly shaking her shoulder. "Excuse me," he said softly, though his voice seemed to disappear in the vast emptiness of the restroom. "Are you all right?" For a moment there was no response. Her eyes remained closed, and her body didn't stir. A sense of unease crept up Robert's spine. What had happened here? Was she simply exhausted from a long shift, or was there something more to this? His instincts urged him to leave, to go back to his office, forget he had seen anything and move on. But curiosity gnawed at him. He couldn't help but wonder, who was this woman? Why was she in this position? And then, as if on cue, her eyelids fluttered open. Her gaze was bleary at first, the fog of sleep clouding her vision. She blinked a few times, trying to orient herself, and when her eyes finally focused, they locked onto his. There was a moment, just a brief moment, where nothing in the world existed except the two of them, a shared stillness, a strange connection in the midst of the unexpected. "Are you okay?" Robert asked again, his voice coming out a little firmer now, though there was an edge of concern that he couldn't hide. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she blinked up at him with wide, startled eyes. For a few seconds she simply stared, unsure of how to react. Then she quickly pushed herself upright, her hands brushing against her uniform as she straightened, trying to regain her composure. I'm sorry," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to fall asleep here." Robert could feel the oddness of the situation pressing in on him. She looked so out of place, yet there was something undeniably intriguing about her. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. It was a quiet, humble sound, a stark contrast to the corporate environment surrounding them. "No need to apologize," Robert said, his tone softening. "Are you all right? You look like you're exhausted." She nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I'm fine, really. I've just been working a long shift. I must have drifted off." Robert studied her for a moment, taking in the way her hands fidgeted nervously with the edge of her uniform, as though she were trying to keep herself together. There was something about her that drew him in, something mysterious and vulnerable. She wasn't just a cleaning lady to him in that moment. No, there was something far more complex lurking beneath her tired exterior. "What's your name?" he asked before he could stop himself. It wasn't a question he'd normally ask someone like her, someone in his position, but something about her, maybe it was the way she looked at him or the way she carried herself, made him curious. Her gaze flickered to the floor, and she hesitated. "Emma," she said quietly. "Emma Turner." "Emma," Robert repeated, the name lingering in the air between them. There was an odd weight to it, something that seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, growing heavier with each passing second. Robert couldn't explain it, but he felt an undeniable pull, a curiosity that pushed him to keep asking, to keep uncovering more about this woman. "What happened?" he asked gently, trying to sound casual despite the storm of questions swirling in his mind. "You're working here? For how long?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "I've been here for about 6 months now, cleaning, mostly night shifts." Robert's mind clicked into place. Night shifts, exhaustion, it all made sense. But there was something else in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. He nodded slowly, unsure of how to proceed. "Well, I'm glad you're all right," he said, his voice losing some of its edge. "I'll make sure someone checks on you." He was about to stand and leave, but a strange sense of hesitation kept him in place. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary encounter. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As Robert turned to walk away, his eyes caught the mop she had been holding, now discarded on the floor. The absurdity of it all. The billionaire CEO, the cleaning lady sleeping on the toilet, kept replaying in his mind. It was so odd, so outside the realm of his daily life, that it almost didn't seem real. But as he reached the door, he couldn't help but glance back at her, Emma, the woman who seemed so ordinary, yet had somehow turned his world upside down in the span of a few moments. He didn't know it yet, but that fleeting, mysterious encounter would be the beginning of something that would change both of their lives forever. The days following Robert Montgomery's unexpected encounter with Emma Turner passed by in a blur. The high-paced, high-stakes world of Montgomery Enterprises continued without a hitch, but something lingered in Robert's mind, a nagging thought, an inexplicable curiosity. He tried to push it aside. He had too many responsibilities, too many urgent matters demanding his attention. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forget Emma, the way she had looked up at him with those tired, almost lost eyes, the way she had tried to make herself small in that sterile office restroom, as if she was hiding not just from the world, but from something deeper, something more personal. It wasn't like Robert to dwell on someone like her. He was a man who dealt with billion-dollar contracts, who had the world at his feet. His life was a well-oiled machine, designed for success. He had long stopped trying to understand people like Emma. They were a part of his life, yes, but they were distant, invisible. Yet somehow, Emma had cut through all that. It wasn't just her situation that intrigued him. No, it was the way she had reacted to him. Most people, employees, associates, even family members, would have been a little more expressive if a CEO had shown any sign of concern. But Emma? She had been quiet, withdrawn, almost embarrassed. It was as though the encounter had shaken her in ways Robert couldn't fully understand. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of people who were used to being ignored, used to being invisible. Days turned into weeks, and Robert found himself thinking about her more often than he cared to admit. He tried to brush it off, but when he saw her name, Emma Turner, on his office's cleaning staff schedule. It felt like fate was pushing him toward her again. One morning, as he was leaving his office for an early meeting, he ran into her again. She was on the floor, cleaning the hallway just outside his office. She was alone, wiping down the marble floors with practiced efficiency, her eyes focused on the work at hand. The air was thick with an awkward silence, as Robert hesitated before approaching. "Emma," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. She looked up from her work, her expression quickly shifting to one of surprise. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice tentative, "I didn't expect to see you here." He smiled, trying to make the situation feel less strange. "I just wanted to check in, see how things are going." Emma quickly lowered her gaze, as if feeling uncomfortable with the attention. "Everything's fine, sir. Just doing my job." There was a tension in her voice, as though she was trying to maintain some distance, some form of professionalism. But Robert could tell there was more beneath the surface. He could see the way she held herself back, as if guarding some part of her life that she didn't want anyone to touch. "You don't have to call me sir," he said, his tone warm. "Robert is fine." Emma glanced up at him, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "Okay, Robert," she said, her voice soft. She paused for a moment before adding, "Thank you for checking in, but I really should get back to work." Robert nodded, but didn't move. There was something in her words, something unspoken, that held him in place. He wanted to ask her more, to get to the bottom of whatever was weighing on her, but he didn't. Instead, he stood there, watching her clean the floors in silence, feeling the distance grow between them. "Are you always on the night shifts?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. She didn't look up, but there was a slight change in her posture. "Yes," she answered quietly. "I prefer it that way. It's less complicated." Robert studied her. For a moment, there was something in her words, something more than just the simple response of a cleaning staff member. It was as though she was hiding a deeper truth, one she wasn't ready to share. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. "You've seemed distant ever since that day in the restroom." Emma stopped in her tracks, her back stiffening at his words. "I'm fine, really," she said quickly. "I'm just not used to people paying attention to me. I don't need it." Her response hit Robert harder than he expected. He wasn't sure why, but it felt like he had struck a nerve, like he had uncovered something she had buried deep inside. He wasn't used to this, used to people hiding from him, avoiding his questions. But Emma wasn't like anyone he had ever met. He cleared his throat, trying to shift the conversation in a different direction. "Well, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I mean it." Emma finally looked up at him, her eyes searching. His face for something, perhaps sincerity, perhaps some sign that he wasn't just another businessman pretending to care. For a moment their gazes locked, and Robert felt a shift in the air between them. It wasn't romantic, or even close to being romantic. It was something deeper, a connection, a raw moment of vulnerability. "Thank you, Robert," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. Without another word, she turned back to her cleaning, her focus now fully back on the task at hand. Robert stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. He wanted to say more, to offer her some kind of comfort, but he couldn't find the right words. Instead, he turned and walked away, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. The next few days passed in much the same way. Robert went about his business, attending meetings, closing deals, running the company, with the same precision and efficiency he always did. But there was a part of him, something he couldn't shake, that kept drifting back to Emma. Her tired eyes, her soft voice, the way she kept to herself, refusing to accept help or attention. It wasn't just her circumstances that intrigued him. It was the way she carried herself, the way she seemed to wear her struggles like armor, refusing to let anyone in. Robert wasn't used to this kind of resistance. People wanted his attention, wanted his approval, wanted to be seen. But Emma, she seemed to want the exact opposite, and yet there was something undeniably magnetic about her. Robert couldn't quite place it, but he was drawn to her in ways he couldn't explain. There was a depth to her that he had never encountered before, a mystery he couldn't solve, no matter how much he tried to focus on other things. One afternoon, a week after their brief conversation in the hallway, Robert found himself walking through the building late in the day. His mind was preoccupied with the usual flood of thoughts about business, but as he passed by the restroom, where he had first seen Emma, something inside him stopped him in his tracks. He couldn't explain why, but he felt the urge to check in on her again, to see if she was okay. He turned down the hallway and approached the restroom door, his heart unexpectedly pounding in his chest. But when he opened the door, the last thing he expected to see was Emma, standing there, her back to him, talking to someone else. A man. The man looked familiar, but Robert couldn't place him immediately. He was tall, well-dressed, with dark, almost hostile eyes. The man's posture was aggressive, leaning in toward Emma, and she looked scared. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes wide. Robert's instincts kicked in. He didn't hesitate. He stepped into the room and addressed the man firmly, his voice cold and authoritative. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" The man turned quickly, a sneer spreading across his face. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Robert didn't flinch. "I'm the CEO of this company, and I'm asking you to leave." The man's eyes burned with a mixture of irritation and hostility. Robert stood firm, his gaze unwavering, though inside his mind raced. Who was this guy? What was he doing with Emma? The situation felt tense, loaded with unspoken words and hidden tensions. Emma, who had been caught in this moment, didn't speak, her hands still clenched around the cleaning supplies. The man shifted his stance, looking Robert up and down, sizing him up. Robert could feel the muscles in his back tense, an instinctual reaction that warned him this encounter might escalate further. "Listen, I don't know who you think you are," the man growled, his voice low and rough. "But I don't need you meddling in my business." Robert's heart rate quickened, his focus sharpening. "I'm the CEO of this company, and I won't stand by while someone intimidates my staff. You need to leave now." The man scoffed and stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "You think you own the world, don't you? All high and mighty in your office? But let me tell you something, buddy. People like you wouldn't even look twice at people like us if we didn't do the dirty work for you." Robert's instincts kicked in. He had dealt with arrogant, entitled people his whole career, but this was something different. This wasn't about business, and it sure as hell wasn't just about Emma's role here. It was something personal. Before Robert could respond, Emma took a shaky step forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, just let it go." Both men turned their attention to her, but Emma refused to meet their gazes. Instead, she stared down at the ground, her hands shaking. The sight sent a ripple of anger through Robert that he couldn't contain. "Emma, do you know this man?" he asked, his voice softer now, more concerned. Emma winced, but she nodded, though it was clear she wasn't happy about the situation. "Yes," she said quietly. "He's someone I used to know." Robert felt a pang of disbelief. "Used to know?" He turned his attention back to the man, who had remained eerily silent while the two exchanged words. There was something about the way the man held himself. His body language was far too confident, too comfortable in the space he had entered. "You're not welcome here," Robert said, his voice hardening again. "Get out. Now." The man sneered. One last time before turning on his heel and leaving, but not before muttering under his breath, "You won't always be around to protect her, CEO. People like her don't just walk away from their past." The words stung, and Robert could feel a chill spread through the air. Emma flinched, as though she had heard this same line too many times before. "Are you okay?" Robert asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though his insides were a mess of confusion and concern. Emma didn't answer at first. She just stood there, her back to him, her head hung low. After a few moments, she spoke in a small, almost defeated voice. I don't want you to get involved, Robert. It's not your problem." Robert wasn't sure why, but hearing her say those words cut deeper than he expected. It wasn't just the defensiveness in her tone. It was the exhaustion, the resignation that weighed so heavily on her. There was a depth to Emma that he had barely begun to scratch the surface of, but in this moment it felt like she was slipping away from him. "I'm already involved, whether you like it or not," Robert replied, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't have to go through this alone." Emma didn't look up. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice barely audible. "You don't know what's happened in my life." Robert opened his mouth to speak, but the words felt inadequate. He didn't know her past. Hell, he barely knew her present. But there was something about her, something raw and honest, that drew him in. She was different from anyone he had ever encountered, and it wasn't just because of the circumstances. It was because she was real. "I don't need to know everything, Emma," Robert said softly, taking a step closer. "I just know that I care about what happens to you, so tell me what's going on. Let me help." For the first time, Emma looked up at him. There was a flicker of something, vulnerability, maybe fear, but she quickly masked it, her expression turning blank again. "You don't get it," she said, shaking her head. "You think you can just swoop in and fix everything with your money and your power, but that's not how it works. You can't fix people like me." Robert felt his stomach twist. "I'm not trying to fix you. I'm trying to understand. You don't have to carry this burden alone." Emma closed her eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. She didn't speak for a long while, and Robert waited, his gaze steady on her, giving her the space to find the words. Finally, she spoke, her voice so quiet that he almost didn't hear it. "You don't know who I am," she whispered. "You don't know what I've done, what he did to me." Robert felt a pang of confusion and concern. "Who?" he asked softly. Emma shook her head. "I can't talk about it. Not now, I can't." But Robert wasn't going to let this go. He could see it in her eyes, the pain, the fear, the anger she was hiding. He knew there was more to her story than she was willing to share. But he couldn't let it end like this, not without knowing what had happened. "Emma," Robert said gently, stepping closer, "please, you don't have to carry this alone. Whatever happened, whatever he did, it's not your fault." Her eyes flashed, but there was more than anger in them. There was something else, a desperation, a hunger for something, more than just an escape. "I don't want pity," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharper. "I don't need your charity. I just want to survive. That's all I've ever wanted, to survive, to get through one day after the next without falling apart." Robert's chest tightened at her words. He had seen this kind of resilience before. People who fought tooth and nail just to get through each day. It wasn't something he was used to, not in his world, where everything was measured in deals and contracts, where people were either winners or losers. But Emma wasn't a loser, she was a survivor. "I don't pity you," he said, his voice firm. "I admire you, your strength, your resilience, but that doesn't mean you have to do this alone." There was a long silence between them as Emma processed his words. Finally, she let out a sigh, her shoulders sagging in defeat. "You really don't understand, do you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand more than you think," Robert replied softly. And that was the moment Emma finally spoke the words that had been hanging in the air for so long. She didn't say it with drama, didn't say it with anger. She simply said it, quietly, as though she was finally admitting a truth to herself. "I was in a relationship with him," she said, her voice trembling. "A relationship that wasn't really a relationship. I was just a tool to him. And when I finally tried to leave, he threatened me. He told me if I ever walked away, he'd make sure I regretted it, that he'd ruin my life." Robert felt his heart race as the weight of her words sank in. He didn't know who she was talking about, but the intensity of her emotions, the fear in her voice, it was enough to make him want to do anything to protect her. "You don't have to be afraid of him anymore, Emma," Robert said, his voice low and steady. "You're safe here. I'll make sure of it." Emma looked at him then, her eyes full of gratitude and something else, something that Robert couldn't quite place. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but just as quickly she closed it. Instead, she nodded once, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't know if I can ever trust anyone again," she whispered. "But thank you for caring." Robert reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently placed it on her shoulder. "You don't have to trust me right now," he said softly. "But I'm here and I'll help you however I can." Emma's lips trembled as she looked at him, and in that moment, Robert realized something. He hadn't just stepped into her world by accident. Something had pulled him here, and now he couldn't walk away. The days after their conversation in the restroom seemed to blur together for Robert. What had started as an unexpected, seemingly insignificant encounter had evolved into something that felt far more complicated. Emma Turner, the cleaning lady who had become the focal point of his thoughts, now seemed to haunt his every moment. Every time he closed his eyes, her face appeared. Her vulnerability, her strength, the weight of her past, and the mysteries she carried with her. Robert had always considered himself a man of reason. His world was built on structure, on calculated risks, and on a foundation of facts and figures. Yet here he was, standing on shaky ground, drawn into something he couldn't quite explain. He had tried to push the thoughts of Emma aside, to focus on his business and responsibilities. But it was futile. Each time he passed her in the building, his eyes would linger on her for a fraction of a second longer than they should. Her presence, though often silent, was unmistakable, and Robert found himself wondering just how much more there was to her story. But the past few days had revealed little to nothing. Emma remained closed off, retreating into the shadows of the office, offering only fragmented pieces of her life. He knew she was hiding something, but no matter how much he tried to push, she would shut him out with an impenetrable wall of silence. It was late one Thursday evening when Robert decided to visit the office once more. The office was quieter than usual, the usual hum of activity, replaced by the distant clattering of keyboards and low conversations that echoed down the long hallway. Most employees had already left for the day, and the building was starting to feel more like a cavernous shell than the bustling headquarters he was used to. As Robert walked down the corridor, his thoughts wandered back to Emma. She was supposed to be finishing her shift by now, but he hadn't seen her in the office all day. He had planned to check in with her to see if she was doing okay, but as he passed the break room, something caught his eye. Emma. She was sitting alone at the far corner of the room, her head down, arms crossed over her chest. Her face was obscured by her dark hair, and the faint sound of her breathing was the only sign that she was still awake. The usual sharpness in her posture was gone, replaced by a softness that struck Robert like a blow to the chest. He stepped forward cautiously, careful not to startle her. As he drew closer, he could hear the faintest hitch in her breath, as though she was holding back tears. "Emma?" Robert's voice was soft, almost hesitant. She didn't respond at first, as though she hadn't heard him. But then, slowly, she lifted her head, and their eyes met. The usual walls she had put up were gone. The tension that had always been between them seemed to dissipate, replaced by a vulnerability that Robert wasn't sure how to handle. She wiped her eyes quickly, as though embarrassed by her tears. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean for you to see me like this." Robert stood still, his mind racing. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when she might finally open up to him. But instead of rushing to offer comfort, Robert took a step back. He didn't want to overwhelm her. He had learned enough from their past conversations to know that Emma needed time, space, and above all, respect. "You don't have to apologize," Robert said gently, his voice steady. "If you want to talk, I'm here. But you don't have to. Talk if you're not ready." Emma let out a shaky breath, the tears continuing to fall, though she seemed to try and control them. She nodded, but said nothing. Her fingers clenched into fists at her sides, and for a brief moment, Robert wondered if she was going to push him away again. But then, almost imperceptibly, she spoke. "I don't know how to start," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know if I can." Robert took a step closer, but he was careful not to invade her space. He didn't want to force her to say anything before she was ready. But the uncertainty in her eyes made it clear that she was fighting with something much deeper than he had initially realized. "You don't have to say everything at once," Robert reassured her. "Take your time." For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken emotions that neither of them could quite articulate. Robert's eyes flickered to the clock on the wall. It was late, and Emma was clearly exhausted, her face pale, her movements sluggish. She wasn't just tired from a long shift. There was something more to it, something that had been building for far longer than either of them could have anticipated. Finally, Emma broke the silence. Her voice was so quiet that Robert almost missed it. "It's not easy, you know," she said softly, her eyes staring down at the floor. "Trying to forget. The things that happened, the things I've done. It's like they follow me everywhere." Robert's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what she meant by "things I've done," but it was clear that whatever she was carrying, it was weighing on her in ways that were difficult to comprehend. "Emma," he said gently, "you don't have to carry this alone. Whatever it is, I'll listen, I want to understand, but you don't have to do this by yourself." She finally looked up at him, and for the first time Robert saw something different in her eyes. A flicker of hope, maybe, or the possibility that she could trust him. The walls she had built around herself were starting to crumble, and the imperson beneath them was beginning to emerge. "It's not just about me," she whispered. "It's about him." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. "Him?" Robert repeated, his voice barely audible. "Who do you mean?" Emma hesitated, her face contorting in pain. She seemed to wrestle with the decision to speak, torn between the urge to confide in someone and the fear that it would only make things worse. "He's someone from my past," she began slowly. "Someone I thought I could trust. Someone who promised me the world, but instead he took everything from me." Robert felt his chest tighten. He didn't need to hear any more. The way Emma spoke about him, the way she looked when she said, "took everything from me," told Robert everything he needed to know. Whoever he was, Emma had suffered at his hands, and the pain she had been carrying for so long was something Robert could never fully comprehend. But that didn't mean he couldn't try. It didn't mean he couldn't be there for her. "I'm sorry," Robert said quietly, his heart aching for her. "You don't have to go through this on your own. I'll help you. Whatever it takes." Emma gave him a sad smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I appreciate that, but there's nothing you can do, not really." Robert wasn't convinced. There was always something that could be done, even if it was just offering her the chance to speak her truth without fear of judgment. He didn't know who the man was or what had happened between them, but one thing was certain. Emma was not the same person she had been before. She was broken, yes, but she was also strong, stronger than she gave herself credit for. "I don't care about what happened in your past," Robert said firmly. "I care about what happens next. And right now, you don't have to face this alone." For a long time, Emma didn't say anything. She just sat there, her body tense, her mind caught in a war between the past and the present. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Luke Bennett, and he was the worst mistake I ever made." Robert's mind raced as Emma uttered the name, Luke Bennett, a name that seemed to carry with it an entire universe of pain and regret, a name that had clearly haunted her for far too long. The air between them had grown thick with the weight of unspoken words. Robert could feel the room close in on him, the oppressive silence heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for Emma to reveal what lay buried beneath the surface. Luke, the man who had been the source of Emma's suffering. Robert didn't need to know the specifics of their past to understand the devastation she had endured. He could see it in her eyes, the pain, the scars, the way she seemed to carry the weight of an entire lifetime on her shoulders. "Emma," Robert said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to tell me everything if you're not ready, but I'm here for you. Whatever happened, whatever he did to you, I want to help." Emma didn't speak at first. She stared at the ground, her fingers nervously twisting in her lap. For a moment, it seemed as though she might retreat again, pulling back into the safety of silence. But then, slowly, she looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "I thought I could escape him," she said quietly, her voice tinged with bitterness. "But he always found a way to come back into my life. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I hid, he always showed up. It's like he had this hold over me, a grip I couldn't escape." Robert's chest tightened at the rawness in her voice. He could hear the desperation in her words, the helplessness that had been seeping into her life for far too long. He had no idea what Luke had done to her, but it was clear that the man had left deep scars on Emma's soul. "He used to be charming, you know," Emma continued, her voice distant as she seemed to drift into the past. "At first, he was everything I thought I wanted. He made me feel special, like I was the only one who mattered. But that was just the mask he wore. Behind it, he was something else entirely, cold, manipulative, and eventually he showed me who he really was." Robert wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but he could tell that Emma wasn't done. She needed to say this, to let it out, to finally free herself from the suffocating grip of her past. So he remained silent, giving her the space she needed. "He promised me the world," Emma whispered, her eyes clouded with pain. "And for a while I believed him, but then he started to change. He became possessive, jealous. He didn't like the way people looked at me, the way I interacted with anyone else. He told me that I belonged to him, and that I couldn't be with anyone but him, that no one else could have me." Robert felt his blood run cold at the intensity of her words. He had seen men like Luke before, men who thought they could control the people around them, who used their power to manipulate and isolate. But hearing Emma speak about it, hearing her voice crack as she relived the moments of her torment, made Robert's heart break for her. "He would follow me," Emma continued, her voice trembling. "He would show up at my apartment unannounced, call me over and over again. He even started showing up at work just to watch me. He said he was protecting me, but it wasn't protection, it was control. He wanted to know where I was, what I was doing, who I was talking to. It became a prison, Robert. A prison I couldn't escape from." Robert's fists clenched at his sides, his anger rising. He could feel the protective instinct within him surge, a fierce desire to shield Emma from this man who had so deeply hurt her. But he knew that the only way to truly help her now was to be patient, to listen, and to support her as she unraveled the knots of her past. "I tried to leave him," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. "I tried so many times. But every time I did, he would come back, and every time he promised me he would change. He told me he loved me, that he needed me, and I wanted to believe him. I thought that maybe, just maybe, he could be the man he once was. But that was a lie. He was never going to change." Robert could see the pain in her eyes, the deep, unhealed wounds that still bled, no matter how hard she tried to cover them. She had given this man so many chances, so much of herself, and yet all he had done was take. He had stolen her sense of safety, her trust, and her ability to believe that love could be kind and unconditional. "And then one day," Emma continued, her voice shaking now, "I woke up and realized I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't live in fear of him anymore. I couldn't be the woman he wanted me to be, the woman who had no voice, no choices. I wanted to be free. So I left. I ran. Her." Words hit Robert like a freight train. He could hear the finality in her voice, the resolve that had carried her out of that toxic relationship and into the unknown. But even then, Robert knew that the freedom she had fought for had come at a steep cost. She had escaped, yes, but the scars of that battle were still fresh, still aching in ways that words could never fully convey. "How did you get away?" Robert asked softly, his curiosity rising despite the sadness that had settled in his chest. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to push the memory back. "I moved here, to this city. I started over. I changed my name, my identity, everything. I thought that by putting distance between myself and him I could finally be free, but even then he found me. It's like he knew where I was, what I was doing. And every time I thought I was safe, he would show up again. He'd send me messages, letters, reminders that he was still watching me." Robert's heart broke for her. She had never truly escaped him. Luke had followed her, tracking her every move, haunting her every step, turning her life into a constant game of hide and seek. No matter where Emma went, Luke was always there, lurking in the background, waiting for her to slip up, to make a mistake. "I thought I was safe here," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "But I was wrong. He found me again, and now I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make him go away. How do you outrun a shadow, Robert? How do you escape something that's always there, waiting for you to turn around?" Robert's mind was racing. He couldn't begin to imagine the terror that Emma had felt, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if today was the day Luke would show up again, wondering if she was truly free. He wanted to help her, to make it stop. But the one thing he knew for certain was that Emma didn't need a savior. She needed someone to stand by her, someone who would give her the strength to confront the past and reclaim her future. "You're not alone, Emma," Robert said, his voice full of determination. "You don't have to face this by yourself. We'll figure this out together. I won't let him hurt you anymore." She looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt, but also something else, something fragile like a flicker of hope. "How?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How can you help me? How can you stop him?" Robert took a deep breath. He didn't have all the answers, but what he did know was that Emma wasn't going to face Luke alone. He would help her, even if it meant going to the ends of the earth to do so. "I don't know yet," Robert admitted, his voice steady. "But we'll figure it out. We'll get through this together." Emma looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his eyes. Finally she nodded, her shoulders sagging, as if a small weight had been lifted from them. "Okay," she whispered. I'll try. I'll try to believe that I'm not alone. The days following Emma's confession had been a whirlwind of emotions for both her and Robert. The burden that had been weighing on her for so long had finally been laid bare, but it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Robert had made a promise, one that he intended to keep, to stand by Emma, to help her confront the past that had haunted her for so long, and to give her the strength she needed to reclaim her life. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be more struggles, more challenges, but Robert was resolute. He couldn't fix everything, but he could offer her his unwavering support. The first step had been difficult. They'd reported Luke's stalking and harassment to the authorities, but Robert knew that the law, while important, wouldn't be enough. Emma's sense of safety, her emotional well-being, those were the things that needed the most protection. And for that, Robert knew he had to be more than just an observer. He had to take action. The following weeks were filled with planning. They worked together to ensure that Emma had a secure place to live, one far away from the city where Luke had stalked her before. Robert used his resources to get her a new apartment, one in a building with top-tier security. He had all the locks replaced, all the windows reinforced, and every possible measure taken to ensure Emma's physical safety. But even with all of that, Robert knew it wouldn't be enough if Emma didn't feel safe emotionally. He spent hours talking with her, comforting her, helping her rebuild the sense of trust she had lost so many years ago. As they spent more time together, Emma started to open up more, not just about Luke, but about her hopes and dreams. It was as if she had been holding her breath for years, afraid to let herself believe in the possibility of a future that wasn't dominated by fear. Slowly, those walls began to come down. One evening, as they sat in her new apartment, sipping tea and talking about everything and nothing, Emma finally spoke up. "Robert, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "You've done so much for me, more than anyone ever has. I don't think I can ever repay you for everything you've done." Robert looked at her, his gaze soft and filled with understanding. "You don't need to repay me, Emma," he said, his voice gentle. "You've already done more than enough just by letting me be here, just by letting me help." Emma smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I've never really let anyone help me before," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always felt like I had to do it all on my own, like if I let anyone in, they'd only end up getting hurt too." Robert reached out and placed his hand over hers, his touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," he said softly. "You're not a burden, Emma. You're not weak for needing help. Everyone has their breaking point. Everyone needs someone to lean on. It's okay to let go." For a long time, Emma didn't speak. She simply looked at him as though she was searching for something. A reassurance, perhaps, or the courage to take the next step. Finally, she nodded, the weight of her emotions settling in. "I think I'm starting to believe that," she said quietly. "That maybe, just maybe, I can let someone in." Robert's heart swelled with emotion at her words. It wasn't just about the physical safety they had secured for her. It was about the healing that was taking place, the quiet strength she was starting to rebuild within herself. It was the beginning of something new for Emma, a new chapter that was no longer defined by fear and pain. But despite all the progress they had made together, the threat of Luke still loomed large. Robert knew that the battle wasn't over. He couldn't allow Emma to think that she was safe just because she had moved away or changed her phone number. He had to make sure that Luke never found her again. And so, Robert made a decision. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way to truly put an end to this. He reached out to a private investigator, someone with the skills to track down Luke and find out exactly where he was, what he was doing, and how to stop him from ever coming near Emma again. Weeks passed, and the investigation continued. Robert kept his distance as Emma worked on reclaiming her life, but every so often their paths crossed. They would meet for dinner or spend time together at her apartment, slowly building a routine, slowly getting to know each other without the weight of the past hovering over them. There were moments of lightness, of laughter, and even joy. It was slow, but it was progress. And Emma was beginning to smile again, truly smile, with a hope in her heart that she hadn't felt in years. Then, one night, just as Robert was finishing up a meeting at the office, his phone buzzed. The investigator had found something. Robert's heart skipped a beat as he read the message. Luke Bennett had been tracked down. He was living in another city now, far from where Emma had been, but he had been keeping an eye on her. He hadn't stopped. He hadn't given up. That night, Robert didn't sleep. He spent the hours making phone calls, contacting law enforcement, and coordinating with the investigator to make sure that Luke would never get close to Emma again. The last thing he wanted was for Emma to live in fear again. The next day, Robert told Emma what had happened. She was understandably shaken, but she also understood that this was the final step. The last piece of the puzzle that would allow her to fully step into the future, free from the man who had haunted her. With Luke's presence eliminated from their lives, Emma began to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. She could breathe. She could think. She could dream again. Weeks later, after everything had been settled, after Luke was officially out of the picture, Emma and Robert sat together in her new apartment, watching the sun set over the city. They were no longer hiding. They were no longer running. They were simply living. "Thank you," Emma said, her voice full of gratitude and relief. "For everything. For not giving up on me when I couldn't believe in myself." Robert smiled, his eyes warm. "You never needed to believe in yourself more than I believed in you." And in that moment, Emma realized something that she had never understood before. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a fighter. She was someone who had been through hell and back, someone who had fought for her life, for her freedom, and for her future. She wasn't broken, she was whole. As the night drew on, Emma and Robert sat side by side, no longer strangers, no longer hiding from the shadows of the past. Together, they faced a future that was full of promise, a future where they could write their own story, one chapter at a time. The end.